Hello again. Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you all for agreeing to serve on this panel. I'm not as nervous now as I was at the forefront, so we're in a good place. I do want to thank all of our sponsors, though. I was negligent in mentioning the great companies that we work with, so thank you all very much for supporting us on this journey. So this panel, the Business of Rare, State of the Industry, I think Amanda, you and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, or when we were thinking about putting this together, and given your role with the RDCC, the Rare Disease Company Coalition, it's clear that a lot of the companies that we work with, and a lot of the companies that you work with, this is top of mind to all of them. And I remember Sheila Frame mentioned it in particular with Amrit. Hi, Betsy. Sheila Frame with Amrit gave a very impassioned speech at the board meeting that we had a few weeks ago. So I'd love for you all to introduce yourselves first, and then I'll kick off the conversation with a general question that I'd love for each of you to answer. So why don't we start with you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Malakoff, Executive Director with the Rare Disease Company Coalition, and really honored to be here today.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm assuming you can hear me. I tend to carry my voice. My name is Jennifer Hawks-Bland, and I am the CEO at NewYorkBIO. Before coming to NewYorkBIO, I spent almost a decade at Merck in government affairs and policy. And before that, I was at GSK. And before that, I'm now a recovering litigator. The joke is that I only depose my teenage children and occasionally my husband.
And I'm Bernard Gilly. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a French gene therapy company called GenSight, targeting mitochondrial diseases, particularly orphan.
Great. Well, it's an honor to have all of you here. So my first question for all of you, I'd love for you to answer, is from your vantage point, how would you describe the current state of the rare disease biotech sector? Let's start with you.
Happy to start. I think there are two ways of looking at it. From a medical innovation perspective, the state has never been stronger. It's phenomenal and so impressive to see the Rare Disease Company Coalition members that have found treatments that were previously unthinkable. So from a medical innovation perspective, it's strong. But we certainly are seeing some concerning economic headwinds with the macro environment right now. We've got the rising inflation, rising interest rates. Investors are wanting to be more conservative. And by its nature, rare disease drug development is much riskier. And so unfortunately, we are seeing some investors cycling off biotech, which is certainly concerning from the rare disease company perspective.
Great.
Yeah, I think totally agree with Amanda, and would say that simply because it's been so long since we saw our market high, right? We're about 18 months off of sort of the biotech market top, if you will, the most recent top. I don't think we can discount the concern over how long it's going to take until we A, stabilize, and then B, start to have growth particularly in the public markets. I think private markets are still I think that's a different equation. But then I also think we do sit here today on Capitol Hill. I don't think you can discount the impact that public policy has on both raising capital as well as getting cures to market.
Great. I'm going to come back to that. Bernard?
Well, yeah, I think the science has never been really so rich, and I think that's really offering a lot of hope. But the development task, and really thank you, Amber. I mean, I was really just touched by what you've said, because I mean, there's a long way between the scientific discovery to being able to have a product approved, and for the orphan market, it's currently really a difficult condition, because we need more money, we need more approval, because more approval will mean more credibility, will mean more money, we need more safety data, particularly in the gene therapy and cell therapy, because there's been a number of setbacks due to concern about safety. And safety is, of course, important, because you want to treat people, not to harm people. And we need now more and more participation of the patients, because this is clearly what is going to be the trigger for us to move forward, is really more patient implication into this.
Okay, great. So my second question has to do with with sort of the theme of our meeting here. Are we in the golden age of research as it relates to rare diseases? You think about Amber's story, and you think about all of the great innovation that's going on in this room. Are we there? And if so, how do we sustain it, right? If we're not, what do we need to be doing from a policy perspective to improve and get there? So first question, do you believe that we're in the golden age of innovation in rare? We'll start with you, Jen.
I hope so, right? I mean, I hope this convergence of lots of companies, lots of patient engagement. We're seeing more and more patient funding. Amber is a fantastic example of what it takes when one person commits to doing something for a loved one. And that is replicated over and over again, that we're seeing across the world, frankly. But I think the headwinds that we mentioned earlier are going to prohibit the Ambers from replicating, right, over and over again, if we're not careful. And that's, of course, what we all are interested in doing, right, is creating a policy environment that will allow us to not only tell stories, but tell successes. And those successes will encourage policymakers to make decisions that help us to do it over and over again. And I don't think we can discount the role of the patient in that conversation.
Great. Bernard, would you like to?
Well, as a former scientist, I think tomorrow will always be better. So I think the golden age is always tomorrow, right? So there'll be more, and clearly there's more now than it used to be in the 2000s and that used to be in the 90s. So yes, things are moving quite fast, and I'm really concerned and surprised with the rapidity of the change in science and the slowness of all this development issue. The invention we are based on the mitochondrial disease dates from 2012. We are going to get an approval in the European market probably next year. That's 11 years of efforts. I mean, maybe we could have done better, but I mean, that's almost what it takes to go from science to a product. So that's really long. This is really long, and it's really, and Amber was underlying this. I mean, we need more accelerated approval, more accelerated review. Approval is a second aspect, but we need accelerated review, and we need really collaboration by the public policymakers to move our product forward.
Great.
Yeah, I think the science of biotech is in its golden age. You know, to echo what others have said, I was moved by Amber's story and also moved by the visual in her presentation that showed how companies are finding ways to treat genetic rare diseases by editing one gene. I mean, that's something, you know, a decade ago was hard to conceive of. So yeah, I think we are in the golden age from that perspective. And, you know, really, I think this is where innovation is happening in this country. I mean, if this rare disease biotech is the hub of innovation here. The RDCC represents 21 life sciences companies, and across those life sciences companies, last year alone, they invested $12 billion in research and development. So that is where innovation is happening, you know, full stop. But as others have said, in order to fully realize that promise and that potential, the companies do need increased regulatory and policy certainty to get there.
I agree. So my next question, and we will have time for questions at the end, right, Katie? And so in terms of the significance of the bear market has been widely reported. In the first quarter of 2022, US-based biotechs venture financing is decreased by 46%. So compared to this same time period in 2021, how is the industry impacted by the current market from your perspective? What does the future look like for rare disease companies? Are they disproportionately impacted by these financial decisions. I know Rini has something to say about that, but yeah, let's start. You can all have a crack at that one.
Do you?
Sure, I'm happy to start.
Okay.
So there's a concerning statistic that we've talked about at the coalition, which is that the majority of clinical stage biotech companies right now only have a cash runway of 12 to 28 months. So the threat is, certainly real for especially, for all of rare disease biotech, but especially for development stage companies. They don't bring in any revenue, right? So they're totally reliant on investors and funding from capital markets. And unfortunately, if they are not successful in that, which again, in this time where investors are really favoring later stage type of assets and not favoring rare disease biotech as much, they have to find other ways to, cut costs, and no one wants to see that. So threat is certainly real. There have been a lot of headlines about some companies that have had to manage through layoffs,
Right.
and that's as a result of, unintended consequences of policy uncertainty causing investors to be, less confident in rare disease biotech, and there is, a consequence, and that's the last thing companies want. Companies want to be able to sustain jobs, create more jobs, and be able to deliver good news to patients. So it's certainly something that has a real consequence and something that we're concerned about.
Great.
Yeah, look, I represent NewYorkBIO. We are the home of capital markets. I think that IPOs and accessing capital markets are a very important function of company growth and development, and therefore the ability to raise capital and deploy it toward developing assets to make it to patients. Did more companies than should have do an IPO in the last 2 years? It depends on who you ask. I certainly think that we are seeing repercussions from a lot of clinical stage companies that did go IPO and now are a little stuck. And I think there is uncertainty around how they will manage their runway, manage their cash, and continue to tap investors, for new capital. And I don't think there's an easy answer. We are seeing, I think, things start to pick up. I think in the first couple of weeks, right in September, I think maybe we've seen 5 or 6, $100+ million, private series raises. But that hasn't necessarily trickled over to the public markets. I don't want to be all doom and gloom, because I think the science people are working on is really important, and I think that ultimately will prevail. I just think it's kind of an unpleasant journey as we go through it.
Good point. Bernard, do you have anything to
Well,
add?
I don't know if I can add anything smart here, because the bear market has been the story of our life since years. So I'm not sure, and I don't have the data whether the orphan drug companies are more impacted than the other ones. But for the orphan drug, I think more concern for me is the change in the pricing policy that we can start foreseeing. And in Europe, it's funny, because it takes like about 10 years for the public policy to get to, okay, we can offer you a pricing that is going to be more or less similar to the US. So everyone was looking at the US prices, it was great. So now they sort of decided that probably it should be good, but immediately after, we start entering into a situation where they are more and more concerned about this pricing to be delivered to those companies. And it's not the companies, we are all funded by the financial market. So we need to offer the financial market the rewards and that they are expecting. So it's not a question of only the price of goods, right? And the price of the cost of development. It's also paying for the financial market multiple that they're asking.
Okay.
Do you think, sorry, I can't help it. Do you think that the way Europeans look, the European governments look at pricing is changing based on what's going on here in the US? Or do you think it was totally separate?
I think to a large extent it has been related with about, as I said, probably 5-6 years delay because we are slow. And now we are almost there. Look at the Luxturna or even the Orgensma pricing, more or less similar. It's slightly less in Europe, but not significantly less. But now there are concern growing in the US and more people looking at different strategy and financial innovation in the pricing. Europe is not ready for this. Our government, it's always social security with public funding for those. So it's good from market access point of view, of course, because there is no problem. Everybody is getting his treatment paid for. But those governments cannot implement this on a several-year basis. For instance, evidence-based pricing is going to be very, very difficult in Europe because they are working on yearly budget, and what's happening next year, they cannot figure this out. Right?
So Amanda, I have a question for you as it relates to the state of the industry and how pre-commercial companies versus clinical early stage companies. Is it different? And if so, from your perspective, how different is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's different just by nature of the fact that clinical stage companies don't have any revenue. So they're forced to either raise funds or seek new partnerships. And again, if they can't do that, then they have to manage against expenses and prioritize what their pipelines are going to look like. And they might not be able to take on everything that they'd like to take on. So the risk is certainly higher. But I think something that's interesting in speaking to our members is that because rare disease takes so much more research and development, companies can never stop investing back into the R&D for their pipelines. So some commercial companies even consider themselves pre-revenue still because they invest their revenue back into their pipelines. We have one member that has a few products in the market, and they invest 75% of their revenue back into R&D. And so as a result, they still have to raise billions from investors to be able to fund their pipeline and run the company. So the risk is certainly real, given that rare disease biotechs have to perform an outsized amount of R&D. They're always going to prioritize that.
Okay. And then the second part of my question has to do with Capitol Hill and advocacy. How might these two companies approach, or how do they approach their advocacy with the Hill differently from your perspective? Are you seeing that with members of the coalition?
Well, I think by nature, clinical stage companies are shorter staffed, right? Someone else had mentioned today, they, some of them are beginning as startups and they have 40 staff. And so they have less time to spend on the Hill if they're looking to raise funds. And so that's part of what we look to do at the coalition is represent those companies and help make sure that their voice is heard in Washington if they don't have as many boots on the ground here.
Right. Jennifer, do you?
Yeah, I was going to say, we have NewYorkBIO companies that have 2 people or 5, right? I mean, maybe they've just spun out of academia and they're trying, proof of concept and de-risking. And so Amanda's point is well taken. I mean, you all are here because you know this is very important to you. But at the same time, we have to be the boots on the ground, or we have to help be the voice of early stage companies that they're worried about their next experiment and their runway financially. And they don't even know they need to worry about policy yet. So that's our job, is to help them do that. So that doesn't enter their equation yet until we ask them to go with us to the Hill.
That's good. So Bernard, I want to turn to you as a company that's headquartered in outside the U.S. As you look at our system, our government system. Is there anything that you'd like to see improved? Number one, what's your take sitting in Paris, looking into the U.S. system? Because I mean, it's a hilarious question, but there are a lot of companies in Europe that would love to establish a foothold or in the United States, and they're, to your point, they're tiny, don't have any idea how a bill becomes a law, and so, but Bernard has, your organization's a little more.
Yeah, it's certainly difficult for me to say anything on your system because I don't know it from the inside. I mean, for sure, all the biotech companies and particularly those in rare disease, we're not developing for French market or the European market. We're developing this worldwide, and also this is a mandatory because there is a need for global access for the patients. So it is mandatory in any case. So we start with our hub. Okay, hub is Europe now, even if Europe is not a single market. It's sorry to say this, but it's 26 different markets. So we have a European agency that's stage 4 of the regulatory, but then market access is due in 26 different countries plus UK now. And so obviously the US market is of primary importance for us. But then, I mean, we are clearly, it's a system that is very readable. I mean, we understand exactly what it needs, but we are not a US-based company. We are a foreign company. We'll remain a foreign company unless we turn all our business in the US. And I got the sense that with our discussion with the FDA, we're not exactly on par with other US companies, and I think I would love to see this evolving now.
For sure.
Because our data are as good for the patients as in Europe as it will be in the US. I mean, there's no reason why it's different.
Can you talk a little bit about your drug development journey as a company and your interactions with, obviously, confidentially, keep aside, just sort of your interactions and sort of how you view the FDA. Any thoughts?
Well, over the past 10 years, I mean, the European agency has evolved very much into a model that is a kind of a copy or different, but a copy of the FDA. So we have now process and we go through the process and we have a number of occasions to discuss and collaborate with the European agency, more than it used to be 10 years ago. FDA is more delicate for us to navigate because yes, there are this process. We know that we have different type of meetings and we can ask for, but there's a limited number. You cannot ask for more than a number of those meetings. And so in a number of occasions, it's very difficult to understand from our standpoint that we're good to go to the next meeting, or we should wait another 2 or 3 months and get the next data point before we ask for this. And also, and that's probably part of of our position in the ophthalmology space. I mean, and interacting with the CBER is difficult because they don't have many ophthalmologist experts. So we need to carefully navigate through this.
Good question. Good point. I had a question that came up in a fundraiser that we had with, or a conversation that we had with Congressman Gus Bilirakis, who's one of the co-chairs of the Rare Disease Congressional Caucus. And incentives came up several times. I think several of our colleagues talked about that. So as I was sitting there, and if I had an audience if I was a congressman or a senator, and the folks came to me and had that conversation, I would want to know some sort of, what is going to move the needle for the rare disease industry? We really didn't get to have that conversation. We talked about incentives writ large, but we really didn't focus in on, correct me if I'm wrong, my colleagues who were there, what would move the needle for this industry from an incentives perspective? Because that term came up throughout the breakfast. And I know Amber had put up in her, orphan drug tax credit and priority review voucher program. So specifically, what do you think would move the needle to improve the overall state of the rare disease industry writ large? Any thoughts there, Jennifer and Amanda?
Well, it's like I've mentioned in some of my remarks, rare disease research is more costly and it has a more difficult economic case. A lot of times companies can spend years working on clinical trials because it's so difficult to recruit patients with having small populations. Amber gave an example of there are more people born with the rare disease that her son has, but not as many of them are being diagnosed. So even just finding who those people are and recruiting them to clinical trials is more difficult than in the standard process. So the economics behind it are tough. Rare disease companies need every incentive available to them to offset that risk. And we've been concerned that the orphan drug tax credit was limited.
Right.
If anything, it needs to be expanded. And so something we're looking at the coalition is a bill called Cameron's Law that would put the orphan drug tax credit back to 50%.
Oh, awesome.
It was 50% when it was established under the Orphan Drug Act. Now it's down to 25%, which is unfortunate. And so we want to see that expanded. And if that was passed, that would send a really positive signal to companies to keep investing in that, their research, and that would send a positive signal to investors as well that there's additional financial certainty that these companies have.
Awesome.
And something as small as we've spent a lot of time through COVID talking about changes to healthcare delivery and where patients access healthcare and clinical trials. And I think when we talk about decentralized clinical trials, you automatically think about large populations, right? I mean, so you're trying to, but if more providers become comfortable with both the diagnosis and the administering and engaging in clinical trials, right, then maybe they're also more likely to recommend that for rare disease patients that they're trying to help figure out and diagnose, right? Because a lot of, I know there is usually a very long process of discovery when you have a rare disease. And, Amber said that it doesn't, we all know this. And so maybe even it's not a policy, but it does have an impact when you talk about allowing clinical trials to take place in other locations than these large medical centers like, at NYU or Columbia or that sort of thing.
Great. I'd like to open this up and have a conversation and a dialogue because that's my preference. I do have one more question as folks go towards the microphones or as they come around. And Rainey, I'm looking at you because you had some comments this morning. Lisa, some comments this morning in the fundraiser. But my question is very specifically, what do you wish Congress knew about your industry or about what it is that you do? What's the one thing that you would tell? What would be your elevator speech? If you had, I asked this at my salon dinner, so I'm just gonna cut to the quick here. You got 10 seconds, okay? 15 seconds with the President of the United States, Nancy Pelosi, someone who can actually do something about your issue. What do you tell them? What's your message? And that's gonna be for, I'm coming around and calling some of you out. But let's start here. Bernard?
I think I'll tell him about the emergency for the patients. This is the key. I think Chris was mentioning this. We need to make sure that the policymakers understand the emergency.
Okay.
I think I would say that from a policy perspective, they need to make decisions that will allow patients to receive treatments as soon as possible and as widely as possible.
Okay.
Yeah, and they need to consider the perspective of rare disease companies that have unique challenges from the rest of industry. Too many policymakers are uninformed about what's so different with rare disease, and so there needs to just be basic education and advocacy, which is something we're working on. And I think also just to stress on a hopeful note that in the coalition we have companies collectively that are advancing over 200 treatments right now and working on them, and so hope is definitely there, and we're really optimistic that we can try to pave the way for companies to be able to bring the treatments to patients, because that's really what motivates them is increasing the or decreasing the number of rare disease patients that don't have any treatment today. It's 90% of rare diseases don't have a treatment, so there's a lot of urgency here.
I would also encourage us to think about the bumper sticker versus the white paper. Many of you have heard me say this before. We always have a white paper. The other side that favors drug pricing restrictions has a bumper sticker.
On that note, we're going to open this up. Questions for the panel or comments for the group? Michelle, can you find Rennie over here? You know I was going to put you on the spot. And then Lisa, you talked to Congressman Bilirakis about the FDA and the lack of coordination. So I want to come to that. So So Rini, I want you to comment on the last question. What's the one message that you would have?
Yeah.
15 seconds, president or any policymaker who can.
Seconds. Do I have to do a timer for this?
Yep.
So I would say for rare disease drug development, and particularly ultra rare disease drug development where there aren't approved therapies, right? You're a pioneer across the board. The risks are so high on every front. You're learning about the disease, you're learning about the regulatory pathway, you're learning about how your drug will work. Like there's risks everywhere. To drive health equity, to drive access to therapies for these patients, you need to take down the risk equation any way you can. So greater certainty in regulatory consistency and interpretation of regulations, greater incentives that might incentivize investors to take those risks in terms of preserving things like the Orphan Drug Act and priority review vouchers. All of that helps balance the equation towards the investment in ultra rare diseases. When you take away from the benefit side, you're just stacking up on the risk side, which is already pretty close to insurmountable. So that would be my pitch.
You can deliver that message tomorrow when we take you to the Hill. I think questions? Peter?
Okay. Well, thank you for the panel. It was really, really insightful. And I had a question maybe going in another direction. Obviously, you talked a lot about R&D costs, and I was wondering if in your company, Bernard, you're also worrying about the commercial costs of bringing a drug to the market and the commercial model, if it's becoming more complex, more costly, and how are you dealing with that?
You bet. It's really, it's increasingly costly, right? Research is probably nothing or almost nothing. And clinical development is quite a lot of expenses. Clinical development, but also manufacturing. Manufacturing in gene therapy and cell therapy is just a nightmare because and that's also something we need more. We need more CDMO that works well, which is another condition. And then 3 years before you expect approval, you need to start working on the market access, on the commercialization structure, preparing this, starting to talk with payers. Even if they are public in Europe, we need to talk to the payers. And yes, that's another log of expenses more, right? It's about probably 10 times more than the clinical aspects. Plus the problematic, which is probably more in Europe, is finding the right guys, those who have already done this in rare disease, in really advanced innovation technology. So we start having this. There are now more protein-based therapy and gene therapy and cell therapy that are commercialized in Europe, but it really comes at a cost, and at a cost that you need to incur about 3 years, even more, before the expected approval that may come or not. So under the current circumstances, with the financial environment, yes, this is tough and this might be cruel. And again, we are lucky enough that the European Investment Bank has taken some action toward this, for not essentially for biotech or rare disease, but for innovative company that goes from deep tech to the biotech. So they took some measure mid of this year, in fact, back in June, where we can find some reasonably cheap money in terms of debt and things like this. But it's tough, yes. And that's probably one of the reasons why a number of our companies are seeking to be acquired by larger guys, because they would just have the resource to do the commercialization.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because we really haven't talked about.
Just thinking that, yeah.
Do you want to address that?
No, we haven't. The M&A word is what we haven't touched on this morning, right? And I don't think, certainly you have some big, right, Pfizer, GBT, or whether or not yay or nay on CGen. You've seen some bigger ones, but I don't think we've seen what we probably would have expected in M&A activity with smaller companies to date.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that's changed as we get closer to JP Morgan and first time in person in the next 2 years or whatever? Do you Do you sense more M&A activity on the horizon? And that's a question for, but
I'd be interested to a raise of hands. Who thinks we're gonna, between now and January, or at JPM, we'll see announcements of more M&A actual deals come through? See, yeah. I don't think we know, right? I think this is such an uncertain market. I think it's hard to tell.
interesting. That surprised me.
And I think what happened with Luxturna and now with Zolgensma in Europe, with Novartis and Roche being involved into this, doesn't help. All right, Luxturna has been, as I understand, disappointing for Novartis. They were expecting more revenues out of Luxturna. I don't know why they have asked, because I mean, I think the patient's still there. But they've been disappointed, and similarly with Zolgensma. So I think that doesn't help for the M&A activity.
Okay, great. We have time for one or two more questions. Yes, Chris?
Thank you for that. Actually, I would just say to the folks here, for small companies, don't be afraid to share with policymakers your development story, including using real numbers. Now, you can't use, you might not be able to use real numbers, but you can use ranges. And you can do it on a confidential basis with staff, but they don't really understand how the orphan drug tax credit goes into decision making. They don't know that out of the $30 billion that the NIH puts in taxpayer dollars, that private industry does $190 billion at zero risk to the taxpayer. And being able to sit down with them and tell the story gives them insight into both the decision point, go versus don't go, but it also gives you the chance to talk about how you integrate the patient collaboration piece into that. So if you haven't done it, but I'd urge you all to consider putting down a couple of case studies that are real and share that with policymakers or staff on a confidential basis that you trust. And if you also have one that fails, I would include that as well.
Bingo, bingo.
So not a question, just an idea.
I mean, Amanda, go.
Hi, this is Heidi Ross with NORD, and I will just echo what Chris said. As patient advocate organization, we also want that data and those stories because that helps us make the case on Capitol Hill too. And sometimes that information, obviously coming from you guys as industry, is really compelling, makes a lot of sense, but it also matters to us because oftentimes we're arguing for the same thing and don't have access to that data. We can't tell the story of what might have been if companies won't tell us that story too. So I would just urge industry to make use of your patient organizations and make use of your stories with Capitol Hill because rare is different and small biotech is different and that has to be shared.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have no comment, Patroski, but just want to echo that because Chris and I will credit to Travere. They're wonderful about this and they really help us as advocates to tell that story effectively.
Amanda, would you like to comment on that? Because not to put you on the spot, but I'll put you on the spot with the coalition. I think one of the things that you've been working on is to try to get those case studies and those real stories because it will move the needle on the Hill.
Yeah, no, thank you, Heidi, for that point. I think NORD and other patient groups have been a great ally, and we've found as the coalition, when we go into Hill meetings and we can stress that we're aligned with NORD or other groups on certain issues, it really goes a long way, and it gives additional credibility to the points we're sharing. So I think that partnership between industry and patient organizations is incredibly important.
I think we have time for one more question, right? Yeah.
Hi, Tim Cote from Only Orphans Cote. Thanks so much. This topic of the tax credit's an important one. You know, Henry Waxman thought that was going to be the big deal for the Orphan Drug Act, as he wrote in his biography. Didn't turn out to be so. Really was exclusivity was the big deal. But there was about 10 years ago a great assessment, an analysis that was done of the IRS tax tapes to look to see how often that tax credit was actually called. You may know that there's actually a form, an IRS form for the orphan drug tax credit. Painfully few, painfully rare does this happen that people even apply for the tax credit. And why is that? Because most of the companies that are doing this are little money hemorrhaging machines. and they don't have any use for a tax credit in the short perspective of things. I always tell my clients, hey, this is important because some big fish is going to eat you, and they're going to want that tax credit, and right along with your tax liabilities goes their tax credit over there. So you should do this because it adds to your asset value. So I agree entirely. We should try to reinstate the tax credit the way that it was originally. But we should also do a lot more education of the coalition members and other small companies that don't even know that there is a tax credit, to tell you the honest to God truth. And they certainly don't really get it over to accounting to apply for it every year, because the data have shown that. And I would also recommend that somebody go back and do another one of those assessments of the IRS tapes, which are public use, and find out just how often this tax credit is actually used, because it appeared the last time it was done, and that was about 10 years ago to my recollection, that it was really underutilized.
Well, thank you. We're at time. Thank you all. Tthank you to our panelists for this.